A king doesn't usually fall because of enemies outside the walls. The king falls when the people closest to him decide he should die. Because the most dangerous assassins aren't strangers. They're trusted advisors, family members, generals, best friends, the ones who stand beside the throne, until the moment they stand behind it. Tonight, we're diving into 7 kings who ruled with absolute power, yet were destroyed by the people they trusted most. Some were poisoned at dinner. Some were betrayed in battle. Some were stabbed by their own guards. And some watched their kingdoms collapse, while their closest allies smiled. And our first story begins with a king so powerful that when his closest men turned on him, the world didn't just lose a ruler, it entered a new age of empire. Welcome back. On this channel, history isn't just dates and battles. It's human psychology played at the highest stakes. Because when you live inside a palace, you don't only fear armies at the border. You fear whispers behind curtains. You fear a smile that lasts too long. You fear the hand that pours your wine. Tonight's episode is about a truth every empire learns the hard way. A king can build walls high enough to stop any enemy. But no wall can stop betrayal from the inside. Because trust is the most dangerous weapon in a royal court. If you trust the wrong person, you don't lose a battle. You lose your life. And often, you lose the future of your entire kingdom. So in these 7 stories, we're not just telling you who betrayed whom. We're going inside the moments where power collapses quietly. A private meeting. A secret letter. A promise made in darkness. A decision whispered between allies. And each case has one haunting pattern. The king never sees it coming, until it's too late to escape. So let's begin with a ruler whose empire stretched across continents, and whose death was arranged by the very people who vowed to protect him. Because when a king like this falls, history doesn't just change. History fractures. Why royal betrayal happens, and why kings are most vulnerable at the peak of power. To understand betrayal in royal history, you have to understand something uncomfortable. A king's greatest weakness is not a lack of power. It's the way power isolates him. Because the higher you climb, the fewer people can speak honestly to you. Every word becomes performance. Every smile becomes strategy. Every gesture becomes a message with hidden meaning. And in that environment, trust becomes rare. But kings still need trust. A king cannot rule alone. He needs generals to command armies. He needs ministers to manage money. He needs courtiers to carry messages. He needs family alliances to stabilize the throne. Meaning the king must build his empire out of human relationships. And human relationships are fragile, especially when the stakes are wealth, land, titles, and survival. That's why betrayal in royal courts is not an exception. It's almost inevitable. Because in a palace, loyalty is usually not love. Loyalty is a contract. Contract that says, I support you, as long as supporting you benefits me. But the moment it stops benefiting, support becomes ambition. And ambition becomes conspiracy. Now add another pressure. Royal courts are ecosystems of rumor. If the king appears weak, people move toward the next king. If the king appears old, people begin investing in his successor. If the king appears ill, the court becomes a marketplace of panic. Because kings aren't just leaders. They are the source of stability. When the king seems unstable, everything shakes. And that's when betrayal becomes most tempting. Not because everyone suddenly turns evil, but because everyone is trying to survive. And survival creates choices that don't look like loyalty. Now here is the most dangerous truth. The king is usually betrayed by those closest to him, because those closest to him have the best access. You can't poison a king from outside the palace. You can't arrange an assassination inside the royal bedroom if you're a stranger. You need someone inside. Someone trusted enough to pass through guards. Someone allowed to whisper in private. Someone with authority to move soldiers quietly. That's why the most devastating betrayals are often committed by a brother, a wife, a general, a best friend, a council member, a personal guard. The king trusts them because he has to, and that trust becomes the doorway. Now one more historical pattern. Betrayal often rises at the peak of power, because the larger an empire grows, the more rivals it creates, the more wealth it controls, the more positions people fight for, and the more the king becomes a single point of failure. If you remove him, you can reshape the entire system. So when a king becomes too powerful, the people around him begin asking a dangerous question. If we remove him, what do we gain? And that question has ended dynasties. Now, in this episode, we'll travel across empires and centuries. But we'll keep our focus tight. 7 kings. 7 betrayals. 7 moments where trust turned into a knife. And we begin with a king whose name is carved into the foundation of Western history. A man who conquered the known world, but could not conquer the fear of his closest men. Because when he walked into that room, he believed he was walking into a meeting, but the people waiting for him had already decided this would be his last day alive. Case number 1. Julius Caesar, the warning, the dagger, and the betrayal that rewrote Rome. Rome, 44 BC. The city is alive, but tense, because Julius Caesar has done what no Roman was ever supposed to do. He made himself unavoidable. He conquered Gaul. He crossed the Rubicon. He crushed his rivals. And now, he stands above the Republic like a shadow that doesn't move. Some Romans call him a hero. Others whisper a word that terrifies them more than any barbarian army. King. Because Rome was built on the belief that kings were monsters. They had overthrown their last king centuries earlier and swore never again. But Caesar is different. He doesn't wear a crown. He wears inevitability. The Senate gives him honors. The people cheer him. Statues rise in his image. And slowly, the boundaries of republic begin to bend around one man. And the people closest to Caesar can feel it. Not the enemy nations. Not the common crowd. The senators. The ones who built their lives on power sharing. Now watching power concentrate like a storm cloud. And at the center of the storm is Caesar's mercy. That's what makes this betrayal so painful. Because Caesar could have destroyed his enemies. Instead, he spared them. After civil war, he offered forgiveness. He restored positions. He allowed former rivals to keep their dignity. He believed mercy would secure loyalty. But in a court of ambition, mercy can look like weakness. And weakness is an invitation. Now, the warnings begin. A soothsayer allegedly says, "Beware the Ides of March." Caesar hears it and dismisses it. And around him, the conspiracy grows. Not in open rebellion, but in private rooms. Whispered agreements. A circle of men, senators, nobles, elites, who decide the republic can only be saved if Caesar is removed. And among them is a name that still shakes the story like thunder. Brutus. Marcus Junius Brutus. A man Caesar trusted. A man Caesar admired. A man some say Caesar treated like family. And that's why the betrayal cuts deeper than politics. Because this isn't just the Senate turning against Caesar. It's his inner circle. It's the people close enough to touch him. Now picture the morning. March 15, 44 BCE. Caesar wakes up. There are stories, some from later writers, about his wife Calpurnia having nightmares, begging him not to go to the Senate that day. He hesitates. For a moment, the world balances on the edge of maybe. And then he goes. Because power demands presence. Because Caesar believes he is Caesar. And because he cannot imagine that men who owe him their lives would decide to take his. He enters the theater of Pompey, where the Senate is meeting. He walks into a room full of familiar faces. And then it happens. The first man approaches him with a petition, an excuse to get close. Another moves behind him. Another to the side. And suddenly, steel flashes. Daggers. Hands that once applauded him, now holding knives. Caesar tries to fight back. He tries to stand. He tries to survive. But he is surrounded. And the most famous moment, whether perfectly accurate or not, still defines the betrayal. Caesar sees Brutus among them. And the meaning of the moment is larger than the words. Whether he said, "Who, brute?" or not. History remembers the same message. Even you? Even you were part of this? And with that realization, Rome's most powerful man collapses. Not killed by a foreign enemy, but by the very institution he had tried to control. Now here's the twist that makes this betrayal even more tragic. The conspirators believed they were saving the Republic. They believed killing Caesar would restore freedom. But Caesar's assassination didn't save Rome. It shattered it. His death ignited chaos. It unleashed civil war. It created martyrs. It allowed new power to rise. And that new power would become something Rome had feared all along. An emperor. Because Caesar's death didn't end monarchy, it paved the road for Augustus. Meaning the betrayal didn't stop the future. It accelerated it. That's the cruel irony of royal betrayal. You kill the king to save the system, and instead, you create an empire. And now, we move to case number 2. Because Caesar's betrayal was political. But the next betrayal is personal. A king who trusted his closest noblemen, invited them into his world, and was repaid with a trap so ruthless that it became the blueprint for medieval murder. The next king is from England. Brilliant, and dangerously confident, and his trusted men would betray him with a smile. Case number 2, Edward II, the favorite, the jealousy, and the betrayal that turned a king into a prisoner. England, early 1300s. The crown sits on Edward II's head, but it doesn't sit securely. Because Edward is not like the kings before him. He's not a warrior king. He's not a charismatic conqueror. He's something more dangerous in a medieval kingdom. A king who can be influenced. And the people around him know it. Because Edward's greatest weakness isn't a foreign enemy. It's the way he gives his trust. Not to the nobles who expect it, but to a favorite. A man named Piers Gaveston. Gaveston is charming, confident, bold, and Edward adores him. He gives him titles, influence, and that triggers a fatal reaction inside the English court. Because medieval nobles didn't just want the king's respect. They wanted the king's attention, and attention meant power. So when Gaveston becomes the center of Edward's world, the nobles begin to see him not as a friend, but as a parasite. The court becomes toxic. Whispers spread. Jealousy hardens into anger. Anger becomes conspiracy. And the tragedy is that Edward doesn't understand what's happening fast enough. He believes loyalty is guaranteed because he is king. But loyalty is never guaranteed. Especially when you humiliate powerful men. Gaveston reportedly mocked nobles, gave them insulting nicknames, and acted like he was untouchable. And Edward's protection made him untouchable. Until it didn't. The nobles force Gaveston into exile. Edward brings him back. They exile him again. Edward brings him back again. And each time Edward protects his favorite, he weakens his own throne. Because the nobles aren't just angry at Gaveston. They're angry at the king for choosing him. And then the betrayal turns violent. In 1312, Gaveston is captured by a group of nobles. And Edward can't save him. Gaveston is executed. A message is sent to the king without words. You are not as powerful as you think. Now Edward's grief becomes rage. He tries to reassert control, but his rule grows unstable. His military failures, especially against Scotland, make him look weak. And in medieval politics, weakness is blood in the water. That's when the most devastating betrayal arrives. Not from an enemy king. From his own wife. Queen Isabella of France. Isabella is not just a queen. She's a political force. And as Edward's reign collapses, she begins to ally herself with his enemies. Including a powerful nobleman, Roger Mortimer. Isabella and Mortimer become the center of rebellion. They raise support. They build alliances. They gather troops. And then they invade England. Imagine that. A queen invading her own husband. A royal marriage turning into a battlefield. Edward is captured. The king is taken like a criminal. He is forced to abdicate in favor of his son, Edward III. And once Edward II is no longer king, his fate becomes terrifying. Because a living former king is always a threat. A symbol that could rally loyalists. A reminder that the throne can be reversed. So Edward is imprisoned. Moved between castles. Controlled. And then in 1327, Edward II dies in captivity, and history becomes ambiguous. Some accounts suggest he was murdered. Some accounts describe a death so brutal it became infamous in legend. Other historians caution that later chroniclers may have exaggerated the method. But the core truth remains. Edward was destroyed by the people closest to him. His own nobles, his own court, and possibly his own queen. It's one of the clearest examples of how a king can lose everything, not because he lacked a crown, but because he trusted the wrong people to stand beside it. Now here's the hook that matters. Edward's betrayal didn't just remove a king. It taught his son a lesson, and Edward III would grow up to become a powerful king, partly because he watched what betrayal did to his father. Which leads us to case number 3, because the next king is betrayed not by weakness, but by obsession. A king who trusted one man too much, and believed that loyalty could be enforced. But the man he trusted would betray him in the most dramatic way possible. And that betrayal would split an entire empire. Case number 3, Henry VIII, the trusted advisors who rose with him and died when trust turned into fear. If Julius Caesar shows you betrayal by ideology, and Edward II shows you betrayal through weakness, Henry VIII shows you something even more dangerous. Betrayal inside a system built on fear. Because Henry VIII didn't just want loyalty. He demanded it. And when a king demands loyalty, the people around him learn to survive by pretending, which means the most loyal-looking faces are often the most careful liars. Henry VIII begins as a young king with charisma, confidence, and ambition. He's athletic, intelligent, magnetic. At first, the court loves him. But as years pass, something changes. Not just his body, his psychology. He becomes obsessed with control. Control of succession, control of religion, control of the story history will tell about him. And that obsession creates the perfect environment for betrayal. Because when the king becomes unpredictable, everyone around him begins to play a terrifying game. How do you stay close enough to remain powerful, but far enough to stay alive? Henry VIII's reign is filled with advisors who rise fast and fall faster. And the most famous example is a man who once held the king's full trust. Thomas Wolsey. Wolsey was brilliant, powerful, politically gifted. He became Henry's right hand, the man who managed diplomacy, policy, and court power. But Wolsey's downfall begins with one crisis. Henry's desperation for a male heir. Henry wants to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. He wants to marry Anne Boleyn. But the Pope refuses. Wolsey can't deliver the outcome Henry demands. And in Henry's mind, failure becomes betrayal. Wolsey collapses from power, accused of treason, and dies before he can be formally executed. And Henry learns a lesson that hardens him. Even the most powerful advisor can be destroyed. If the king decides you are no longer useful, then comes the next trusted man, Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell is a different kind of advisor. Less glamorous, more ruthless. He helps Henry achieve something that changes England forever. The break with Rome. The creation of the Church of England. The seizure of monastic wealth. Cromwell becomes the architect of a religious revolution, one that makes Henry not only king, but spiritual authority. For a time, Cromwell is untouchable. But then the same pattern repeats. Cromwell arranges Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, a political match. Henry hates it. He feels humiliated. And once again, the king's embarrassment becomes someone else's death sentence. Cromwell is arrested, accused, executed. A man who changed England, killed because the king's trust turns into rage. Now, here's the chilling point. Was Cromwell betrayed? Or did he miscalculate? In a court like Henry's, the difference almost doesn't matter. Because the court itself becomes a betrayal factory. People betray each other to protect themselves. They accuse first, so they won't be accused. They distance themselves from doomed allies, before the king notices. Under Henry VIII, the court becomes a place where survival means abandoning trust. And perhaps the most tragic, trusted betrayal isn't an advisor at all. It's a queen. Anne Boleyn. Henry chases her like destiny. He breaks religion for her. He risks war for her. And then, once she fails to give him the son he wants, she becomes vulnerable. Accusations appear, some likely fabricated, some politically convenient. The court shifts. The knives come out. And Boleyn is executed. And here's the deeper betrayal. Even if Henry believed she had done wrong, his court knew how to weaponize his fear and obsession. They knew the king's mind. They knew the pressure points. They knew exactly how to push him toward a decision that removed obstacles. This is why Henry VIII belongs in this episode. Because his reign demonstrates a brutal truth. Sometimes betrayal doesn't come from a single person. It comes from a system where trust is impossible. Where everyone becomes both ally and enemy, depending on the king's mood. And now we move to case number 4, because the next king is betrayed in the most emotionally horrifying way. A king who trusted his closest military and political allies, and was repaid not with a dagger in a senate, but with something worse. The trap. A staged surrender. A betrayal that made him watch his own authority collapse, while his friends promised they were saving him. And the king is one of the most famous in English history. King Richard II. A ruler who believed in divine right, until betrayal proved power can be taken like a crown off a table. Case number 4. Richard II, betrayed by his nobles, and forced to watch the crown leave his hands. England, late 1300s. The kingdom looks stable from the outside. But inside the royal court, something dangerous is happening. Because Richard II doesn't rule like a man who thinks he has power. He rules like a man who believes he was born with it. He believes in divine right. The idea that the crown is not a job. It's a sacred destiny. And that belief makes Richard confident. But it also makes him blind. Because when a king believes his authority comes from God, he can underestimate the people who believe authority comes from steel. From alliances. From money. From fear. Richard becomes king as a boy, after the death of Edward III. And early on, he survives storms that would crush most rulers. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381. He faces crowds and chaos and somehow, unbelievably, stays on the throne. But surviving rebellion as a child gives Richard a dangerous lesson. That he is untouchable. And as he grows older, he becomes more controlling, more suspicious, more determined to punish anyone who challenges him. He surrounds himself with favorites. He elevates loyalists. And he starts treating powerful nobles not like partners, but like threats. In medieval England, that is a fatal mistake. Because nobles aren't just rich people. They are private armies. They are regional power centers. They are potential kings waiting for a moment of weakness. Richard tries to neutralize them. He arrests rivals. He seizes lands. He demands obedience. He thinks the throne is enough. But the kingdom is not ruled only by the throne. It's ruled by relationships. And Richard's relationships are rotting. Now enter one of the most important figures in this betrayal. Henry Bolingbroke. Richard's cousin. Son of John of Gaunt. A man with royal blood and noble support. At first, Bolingbroke is part of the royal world. He belongs close to the crown. But Richard turns on him. Bolingbroke is exiled. His inheritance is threatened. And Richard, whether through arrogance or desperation, makes a choice that will destroy him. He takes what Bolingbroke believes is rightfully his. And that transforms Bolingbroke from a noble into a rival with a cause. Now here comes the moment where betrayal becomes destiny. Richard leaves England. He goes to Ireland. And the moment he leaves, the system shifts. Bolingbroke returns, claiming he only wants his inheritance back. But everyone knows what's happening. Because power doesn't care what you claim. Power cares what people follow. And nobles begin rallying to Bolingbroke. Not because they all love him, but because they fear Richard. Because Richard has been tightening the crown like a noose. And now they see a way out. Richard returns from Ireland, and the world has changed. The alliances are broken. The nobles are no longer his. The kingdom is moving under him like a floor giving way. And then the betrayal becomes total. Richard is captured. The King of England is taken. And now we reach one of the most psychologically brutal scenes in royal history. Richard is forced to abdicate. Not killed immediately. Not executed in public. But humiliated. Made to surrender his crown. To watch his authority leave his hands. And the people around him, the nobles, the power brokers, they don't stab him like Caesar. They do something colder. They legalize the betrayal. They turn it into procedure. They dress it in legitimacy. They tell the kingdom it is necessary. And then Henry Bolingbroke becomes King Henry IV. Richard is imprisoned. And within a year, Richard is dead. Official accounts suggest he died in captivity, possibly starved, possibly murdered, possibly left to fade quietly. The details remain debated in medieval scholarship. But the outcome is not debated. Richard II was betrayed by the class that was supposed to support him. The very nobles whose loyalty he demanded chose the man who could protect their interests. And that's the lesson of this case. A king can have divine right, but if he loses human loyalty, his crown becomes a costume. Now we move to case number 5. Because if Richard II shows you betrayal through political overthrow, the next case shows you betrayal through family. A king who trusted the people closest to his bloodline, and was repaid with one of the most infamous betrayals in royal history. A betrayal so famous it still defines the word treachery. A Scottish king. A banquet. The promise of safety, followed by murder. Case number 5. James I of Scotland. The king who believed he was safe, until the betrayal entered his bedroom. This is where the episode turns darker. Because some betrayals are political, some are strategic, but the most horrifying betrayals are intimate. They happen in places where a king should be safest. A palace, a locked door, a room filled with guards, who are supposed to protect him. Case number 5 begins with a king who already knew what betrayal felt like. James I of Scotland spent much of his early life as a hostage. Captured while traveling, he was taken to England and held for years, growing up in captivity, learning politics and survival the hard way. Eventually, he returns to Scotland and becomes king. And he returns with a mission: to strengthen the monarchy, to control the nobles, to make Scotland stable. But here's the problem. Scotland's nobles didn't want a strong king. They wanted a manageable king. So James does what many rulers do when they try to centralize power. He punishes those who challenge him. He takes lands. He reduces noble privilege. He demands obedience. And that creates enemies. Powerful enemies. The kind who don't fight you openly. They wait. They plan. They whisper. And then one night in February 1437, the plan reaches its final form. James is staying in the Blackfriars Monastery in Perth. He believes he is safe. He is surrounded by his court. He is in a building guarded by loyal men. But loyalty in a royal court is often an illusion. Because the conspirators don't need to defeat the king's army. They only need to defeat the king's trust. A group of nobles, led by Sir Robert Graham, move into the building. And what happens next is not a battlefield scene. It is a horror scene. They force their way inside. They hunt the king. And James tries to escape. There's a famous detail in the accounts. James attempts to flee through a sewer or drain opening, an improvised escape route. But the opening had been blocked. And that's what makes the betrayal feel engineered. Because someone had to know. Someone had to prepare. Someone had to remove the king's exits. In the chaos, Queen Joan fights to protect him. She is wounded trying to stop the attackers. But the attackers reach James. And the king is murdered. Not in a public square. Not in war. In a room where he believed he was protected. Now here's why this case is the turning point of our episode. Because it reveals how betrayal works at the highest level. It isn't always about a single moment of violence. It's about everything that comes before it. The access. The planning. The inside knowledge. The compromised security. And that brings us to the most terrifying truth. A king can build castles. But if the people who guard the doors turn against him, the castle becomes a cage. James's assassination is brutal, but it's also symbolic. Because it shows you that kings don't just die from enemies. They die from the people they force into silence. Now, we move from medieval murder to something more modern and psychologically complicated. Case number 6 is not a king stabbed in the night. It's a king betrayed through manipulation, through influence, through a trusted friend who helps him fall while pretending to hold him up. A king who became surrounded by men who promised loyalty, but were secretly building a new power structure behind his back. And that king was one of the most famous monarchs in Europe, King Louis XVI of France. Because when Louis trusted the wrong people, it didn't just cost him his crown. It cost him his head. Case number 6, Louis XVI, the king who trusted his court, while revolution built a guillotine outside. France, late 1700s. The Palace of Versailles is still glittering. Mirrors. Ceremony. From the outside, it looks like the monarchy is eternal. But inside the kingdom, the ground is cracking. France is drowning in debt. The poor are starving. The price of bread becomes a daily crisis. And in the middle of this storm sits a man who is not evil, not cruel, not a monster, but something that can be even more fatal in a revolution. The king who hesitates. Louis XVI inherited a kingdom that needed urgent reform. But reform threatens the people closest to the throne. The nobles, the clergy, the court insiders who profit from the old system. Louis tries to balance it. He listens to advisors. He changes ministers. He considers reforms, then pulls back. And the more he hesitates, the more the revolution grows. Now here is where betrayal becomes the main character. Because Louis doesn't just face anger from the streets. He faces manipulation from inside the palace. Some advisors urge reform. Others urge repression. Some nobles pretend loyalty while preparing escape plans. And foreign powers watch closely, waiting for weakness. Louis becomes trapped. Every option feels like a trap. If he reforms too much, the nobility turns on him. If he reforms too little, the people turn on him. And then comes the moment that changes everything. The king tries to flee. The flight to Varennes. June 1791. Louis and his family attempt to escape Paris. They disguise themselves, hoping to reach a safer region and regain control. But they are recognized, stopped, arrested, brought back. And that one failure becomes a symbol of betrayal in the public mind. Because the people don't interpret it as, the king was scared. They interpret it as, the king is betraying France. The king is abandoning his nation. The king is plotting with foreign powers. And now, the monarchy becomes politically toxic. The court, sensing doom, begins to fracture even faster. Some nobles flee. Some plot. Some lie. Some negotiate their own safety. And Louis remains, surrounded by people whose loyalty is no longer about love, but survival. Now the revolution radicalizes. The king is put on trial. And Louis, who once believed in divine right, is forced to defend himself like a citizen. In January 1793, Louis XVI is executed. And the betrayal here is complex. It isn't one man stabbing him. It's an entire system collapsing. It's a king betrayed by his court, which failed to unify around reform. His nobles, who resisted change until the kingdom exploded. His own indecision, which made him unable to control the narrative. And a revolution that saw him not as a person, but as a symbol. Because once a king becomes a symbol, his death becomes a statement. Louis trusted his world to remain stable. He trusted the old order. He trusted that his title would protect him. But the people closest to him, and the system that fed them, could not protect him from history. Now, for our final case, we return to something more personal again. Because case number 7 isn't about revolution alone. It's about the deepest betrayal a king can face. The betrayal of a general. A trusted commander. A man who holds the army. A man who holds the future. And when that man turns, the king doesn't just lose a battle. He loses everything. Our final case is one of the most famous betrayals in world history. King Leonidas of Sparta, betrayed by a Greek who led the Persians around the mountain. Because the most dramatic last stand in human history. was undone by a single act of betrayal. And once you hear the detail that changed the entire battle, you'll understand why betrayal doesn't need an army. It only needs an opening. Case number 7. King Leonidas, the last stand, and the betrayal that turned heroism into massacre. 480 BC. A narrow strip of land called Thermopylae. Mountains on one side, sea on the other. A choke point where numbers don't matter as much as courage. This is where King Leonidas of Sparta makes a decision that becomes legend. The Persian Empire is coming. Not an army, an ocean of soldiers. A force led by Xerxes, so large that ancient writers described it like a moving shadow over the earth. Greece is divided. Some city-states want to fight. Some want to surrender. Some want to survive no matter what it costs. But Leonidas chooses resistance. He arrives at Thermopylae with a small coalition of Greek forces. And yes, his personal guard of Spartans becomes the headline of history. But this story isn't only about bravery. It's about what bravery becomes when betrayal opens a door. For days, the Greeks hold. Persian forces crash against them and break. The narrow pass becomes a weapon. The Spartans fight like machinery, disciplined, brutal, precise. And the Persians begin to realize something horrifying. They can't win this fight head-on. Not here. Not in this pass. So Xerxes does what empires do when strength fails. He looks for a weakness. And that's when the betrayal steps out of the crowd. A local Greek named Ephialtes approaches the Persians. He doesn't bring an army. He doesn't bring weapons. He brings information. A secret path through the mountains. An alternate route that can surround the Greeks. A way around the wall. And that moment changes everything. Because it proves the oldest rule of war. A fortress falls not because the walls are weak, but because someone opens a gate. With Ephialtes' guidance, Persian troops march through the hidden path at night. And when dawn comes, the Greeks realize the nightmare. They are surrounded. Now, Leonidas faces a decision. He can retreat. He can try to save himself. He can run and preserve the army. But if he retreats, the path to Greece opens. The Persians surge forward. The city-states fall one by one. So Leonidas chooses the last stand. He sends many allies away, so they can survive and fight later. And he stays with a small force, including Spartans and other Greeks who refuse to leave. This isn't just bravery. This is strategy. This is sacrifice as message. Because sometimes a king doesn't fight to win. Sometimes a king fights to buy time, and to create a story strong enough to unite an entire civilization. And that's what Thermopylae becomes. The Spartans fight until they are overwhelmed. Leonidas dies. The pass falls. The Persians advance. But the story spreads faster than the army. And Greece, fractured, jealous, divided, begins to harden into unity. Because Leonidas' death becomes a symbol that says, we can resist. We can bleed the empire. We can refuse to kneel. And that is where betrayal becomes even more painful. Because Ephialtes didn't just betray a king. He betrayed a moment. A moment that could have ended differently if the pass remained sealed. And his name becomes one of the most infamous in Greek memory. Not because he killed Leonidas with his own hands, but because he guided death to the door. Now here's the emotional resolution of this episode. Every king we covered tonight lost power in a different way. Caesar trusted the Senate's honor and found knives. Edward II trusted the wrong relationships and became a prisoner. Henry VIII trusted no one and created a court where everyone betrayed everyone. Richard II believed the crown was sacred and watched it taken legally. James I believed a locked door meant safety and died inside it. Louis XVI believed tradition could hold the kingdom together and watched tradition collapse. Leonidas trusted the terrain and watched betrayal erase the advantage. Different eras. Different empires. Same truth. Kings don't fall because they are weak. Kings fall because trust is fragile. And once trust breaks, power collapses faster than any army can march. Now we enter modern analysis, because betrayal didn't die with crowns. It simply changed costumes. The king, today might be a president, a commander, a movement leader. And the betrayal still comes from the same place. Inside. Why betrayal is still the fastest way to destroy power. Even today. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Royal betrayal didn't disappear when monarchies lost their crowns. It just evolved. Today, we don't always call them kings. We call them presidents, generals, founders, CEOs, revolutionary leaders, dictators. But the psychology is identical. Because power still creates the same three forces. Isolation, paranoia, and ambition. And those forces still produce betrayal. A leader rises, surrounded by loyal supporters. At first, everyone believes in the same dream. But as the leader gains more power, the circle tightens. Fewer voices get access. Fewer people can disagree. And more people begin whispering to each other instead of speaking openly. That is where betrayal is born. Not always out of evil, but out of fear. Fear of being replaced. Fear of being punished. Fear of losing influence. Fear of being forgotten. Now think about Julius Caesar. His betrayal wasn't only about ideology. It was about men who felt politically suffocated. They believed Caesar would erase their future. And that same logic happens today in leadership circles. If someone feels locked out of power, they start looking for ways back in. If a leader starts pushing too hard, their allies begin planning their exit. Sometimes that exit becomes a coup. Sometimes a scandal. Sometimes a leak. Sometimes a quiet assassination of reputation. Because betrayal today doesn't always require a dagger. It can be a message sent to the press, a phone call to prosecutors, a leaked recording, a witness who changes a story, a boardroom vote, a military unit that suddenly switches sides. And that's what makes betrayal more dangerous now than ever. Because modern betrayal can happen instantly and spread globally in minutes. A king in the medieval world could be betrayed in a room. A leader today can be betrayed on a screen. And once a narrative turns, the fall can be faster than any battle. Now here's the most important modern lesson from these 7 kings. The people closest to power are not always the most loyal. They are often the most strategic. Because proximity is opportunity. And opportunity creates temptation. That's why leaders throughout history, from emperors to presidents, often become obsessed with one thing. Loyalty tests. They demand public praise. They punish criticism. They reward obedience. But loyalty tests create a paradox. The more a leader demands loyalty, the more fake loyalty appears. And fake loyalty is the perfect disguise for betrayal. That's exactly what we saw with Henry VIII. He built a court where survival meant acting loyal, while secretly calculating the king's moods. And when modern leaders surround themselves with yes-men, they create the same vulnerability. Because when nobody tells the truth, the leader becomes blind. And blind leaders fall. So if betrayal is still the fastest way to destroy power, what is the only real defense? It isn't fear. It isn't punishment. It isn't control. It's structure. Systems where disagreement is allowed. Institutions that prevent one person from becoming untouchable. Checks that stop power from isolating itself. Because when power becomes a personal bubble, it becomes a target. And that's why royal history matters. It teaches us that betrayal is not just a moral failure. It's a predictable outcome. In systems where trust is fragile. And ambition is rewarded. And now, we end where we began. A king doesn't usually fall because of enemies outside the walls. A king falls because someone inside the walls decides, he's in the way. If you've made it this far, then you already know the terrifying truth. Power doesn't collapse slowly. It collapses suddenly, the moment trust breaks. Because a king can survive enemy armies. But no king survives betrayal from the inside. And if these stories taught you anything, it's that history isn't shaped only by battles. It's shaped by private decisions. By whispers. By allies who secretly decide the throne should belong to someone else. So if you want more cinematic history storytelling, episodes that feel like a thriller, but are grounded in real events, subscribe. Because next time, We're going even deeper into the most dangerous part of history. Queens who destroyed kings from the inside. Women who weren't just royal wives, but political forces. Queens who weaponized influence, alliances, and desire to bring down the most powerful men on earth. Some poisoned, some manipulated, some started wars, and some didn't just betray a king, they rewrote an entire dynasty. And the first queen in the next episode was so feared that even after she died, people said her ambitions still haunted the palace. There's a reason betrayal stories hit harder than war stories. Because war is expected. You know enemies want you dead. But betrayal is personal. It comes from a hand you've shaken, a voice you've trusted, a face that smiled at you yesterday. And that's what makes royal betrayal the purest form of danger. Because kings don't die only from violence. They die from the moment they realize the people closest to them are no longer theirs. Julius Caesar walked into a room of friends and didn't walk out. Edward II believed love could protect him and ended up a prisoner. Richard II believed the crown was sacred and watched it taken like an object. James I believed a locked door meant safety and found assassins in his own home. Louis XVI believed tradition would hold the world together and watched tradition collapse into a blade. Leonidas believed the mountain pass was his advantage until one man sold the secret path. And in every case, the king's final enemy wasn't a foreign army. It was someone he had already let inside. So tonight, when you think about power, don't imagine crowns. Imagine trust. Because trust is what holds a kingdom together. And trust is what destroys it when it breaks. History doesn't end because a king dies. History changes because people close to him decide he must fall. And the most frightening part is this. Betrayal is not rare. It is predictable. It happens whenever power becomes isolated and ambition becomes more valuable than loyalty. So the next time you hear a leader say, "I only trust my inner circle," remember these 7 kings. Because the most dangerous words in history are not shouted by enemies. They're whispered by friends, right before the door closes.